The morning light filtered through the yellowed curtains as Annie stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Plain features, sun-weathered skin, calloused hands, a stark contrast to her beautiful sister Evelyn. When Evelyn refused to honor her promise as a mail-order bride, their father forced Annie to take her place. "What prospects do you have here anyway?" he sneered. Bound by family obligation, Annie journeyed west to Wyoming Territory, carrying a photograph of her sister and a heart heavy with dread. What would Jesse Hartland do when he discovered the deception? A war veteran with 200 acres and a home built by his own hands, he expected golden beauty but would receive work-worn practicality instead. Annie never imagined that in the harsh wilderness, a man might see beyond pretty facades to the strength of her character and choose her forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The morning light filtered through the yellowed curtains of the Mallister farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor as Annie pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching dust devils dance across the Nebraska prairie. Her 24 years of life etched into the calluses of her hands and the weather-worn features of her face that stood in stark contrast to her younger sister Evelyn's porcelain beauty. Annie had long accepted her place as the plain sister, the one whose sunburned skin spoke of years spent in fields rather than parlors, until that fateful morning when her father's voice thundered up the narrow staircase like a whip crack, summoning her to witness Evelyn's pretty tears, as she declared she couldn't possibly marry the Wyoming rancher she'd been corresponding with for 6 months, Jesse Hartland, who had already sent money for her passage west. And then Evelyn's miraculous transformation from sobbing hysteria to cool calculation as, she suggested, "Then let Annie go." Words that fell like stones into still water while Annie felt every eye turn to her, her heart pounding against her ribs as she whispered, "What?" Only to have her father study her with cold eyes and ask what prospects she had in a town where her sister outshone her at every turn. "I won't lie to him," Annie said firmly, to which her father replied, "Then tell him the truth when you arrive, but you'll go. Girl, you'll honor this family's commitment," making the decision final and giving her just 2 days to prepare for a journey to meet a stranger who was expecting her beautiful sister instead of plain. Practical Annie. Those 2 days passed in a blur as her mother helped her pack her few possessions. Practical dresses mended multiple times, her mother's Bible, some preserved food for the journey, while Evelyn avoided her entirely, though Annie heard her laughing with friends, already recovered from her so-called crisis. That night, Annie discovered Jesse Hartland's letters hidden in her room, placed there by Evelyn, and read them by candlelight, glimpsing the man she was being sent to, his careful, educated handwriting describing his 200-acre ranch in Wyoming Territory, the cattle and horses, mountains that touched the sky, and the loneliness he tried to disguise between descriptions of daily life. A 31-year-old war veteran who had built his home with his own hands and wanted a partner strong enough for frontier life but gentle enough to make a house a home. And as Annie's fingers traced his words, she wondered what he would think when plain, work-worn Annie stepped off that coach instead of the golden-haired beauty whose photograph he'd praised and imagined in his home. Thursday dawned gray and bitter as the family gathered at the coach station, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air, while Thomas pulled Annie aside to remind her she was representing this family. Her mother pressed a small cloth bundle of peppermint candies into her hand with a whispered, "For the journey," and Evelyn stood apart in her blue wool coat, something flickering in her gaze, guilt perhaps or relief, before she looked away without a word of farewell. Boarding the stagecoach between a minister and a heavy-set woman, Annie looked back once to see her family already walking away, only her mother raising one hand in goodbye, as the coach lurched forward on a journey that stretched endlessly through changing landscapes, familiar farmland giving way to endless prairie, and finally to rocky, mountainous terrain, her back aching from constant jostling, her traveling dress collecting dust despite her efforts to keep it clean. Her fellow travelers proved interesting companions. Reverend Palmer, who shared news from his newspapers and spoke of opportunities for those brave enough to seize them, and Mrs. Creddick, who complained constantly about everything before finally asking on the 3rd day, "And why are you heading to Wyoming, dear?" To which Annie quietly replied, "To be married," launching a conversation where Mrs. Creddick laughingly asked if she was brave or desperate to be a mail-order bride. Annie turned to watch the landscape roll by, wondering if she was perhaps both or neither. Simply Annie Mallister, sent to fulfill her sister's obligation and carrying the weight of family honor on her shoulders as the mountains grew closer, stark and beautiful against the endless sky, knowing that somewhere in their shadow waited Jesse Hartland, expecting a golden-haired beauty who wrote sweet letters and promised to make his house a home. Instead, he would get Annie, plain, work-worn, and terrified, steeling herself to face a stranger who would likely send her straight back east when he saw the sisters switch deception, yet determined to be honest from the first moment, to tell him the truth and face whatever consequences came. The coach carrying her inexorably toward a future she hadn't chosen but now had to embrace. The vast Wyoming territory spread before her like a canvas of uncertainty, the dust of the journey settling on her clothes as a physical reminder of how far she'd come from the Nebraska farm and how much farther she might have to go once Jesse Hartland saw the truth standing before him instead of the bride he'd been expecting. The looming mountains seemed to whisper warnings as the stagecoach driver announced they were approaching their destination, and Annie straightened her spine, smoothed her travel-worn dress, and prepared to meet the man whose letters she'd memorized, whose life she'd been forced to enter, and whose disappointment she would have to face head-on with nothing but her honesty and determination to offer in place of her sister's beauty and charm. The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside Clearwater Station, a dusty collection of wooden buildings that constituted the nearest town to Jesse Hartland's ranch, and Annie's heart hammered against her ribs as she caught sight of a tall man standing apart from the small crowd, his broad shoulders straight beneath a worn canvas coat, one side of his face bearing the unmistakable mark of fire, a jagged scar that pulled at the corner of his right eye and traced down his cheek to disappear beneath his collar, while his gray eyes scanned the arriving passengers with quiet intensity until they settled on Annie, a flicker of confusion crossing his features as she stepped down from the coach with trembling legs and gathered her courage to approach him. "Mr. Hartland?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, and when he nodded, she continued without preamble. "I'm Annie Mallister, Evelyn's sister, and I need to explain something important before we go any further." Proceeding to tell him everything about Evelyn's refusal, her father's insistence, and her own reluctance to participate in the deception, the words tumbling out in a rush while she waited for his anger or rejection. Jesse listened in silence, his weathered face unreadable as the wind kicked up dust around them, and then to her astonishment, he simply nodded and said, "You told me the truth when you could have tried to fool me, Miss Mallister. And that's worth something out here where a person's word is sometimes all they've got." Before loading her trunk onto his wagon and offering his hand to help her up to the seat, explaining during the long, bumpy ride to the ranch that he'd been more interested in finding a partner with strength and honesty than a pretty face that might wilt under the harsh realities of frontier life. The ranch itself proved both more impressive and more demanding than Annie had imagined. 200 acres of grazing land bordered by pine forests and bisected by a clear running creek, with a solid 2-story log house Jesse had indeed built with his own hands, a barn housing 4 horses and 2 milk cows, a chicken coop, and various outbuildings that together formed the heart of his hard-won domain. Annie's first weeks at the ranch unfolded in a whirlwind of learning and adaptation, as Jesse patiently showed her the rhythms of their new shared life. How to work the pump that brought water from the well, where the vegetable garden struggled against the unpredictable weather, which parts of the roof leaked during rainstorms, and how to handle the temperamental wood stove that heated both the house and their meals. In return, Annie brought her own skills to bear, transforming the sparse interior of the house with clever touches, curtains made from flour sacks, a braided rug from scraps of old clothing, wildflowers arranged in mason jars, while also proving herself capable in the garden, with the animals, and even in helping with fence repairs when needed. Evenings found them sharing quiet meals at the kitchen table, their conversations gradually evolving from practical matters of the ranch to deeper sharing. Jesse speaking of his experiences in the war that had left both visible and invisible scars, Annie revealing the years of living in her sister's shadow and her fears that she would never be enough. One evening, as summer's heat began to give way to autumn's cool embrace, Jesse cleared his throat awkwardly and said, "I respect you, Miss Mallister, and I believe we work well together. but I won't hold you to your sister's commitment if you wish to return east or make your own way elsewhere." To which Annie replied after careful consideration, "I'd like to stay, Mr. Hartland. If you're amenable, I think we could build something worthwhile here, together," which led to a simple wedding ceremony the following Sunday with Reverend Palmer officiating and only the neighboring ranchers as witnesses, followed by a modest celebration with apple pie and fiddle music under the stars, marking the official beginning of their partnership. Autumn passed and winter descended with howling winds and snow that transformed the landscape into a breathtaking but dangerous wilderness, during which Annie and Jesse grew accustomed to each other's presence, developing routines and sharing the load of daily chores, she learning to shoot for protection and hunting, he discovering her talent for numbers, as she reorganized his haphazard ledgers and identified ways to increase the ranch's efficiency. Spring brought calving season, where Annie proved her mettle by staying up through freezing nights to help struggling mothers deliver, her hands becoming as skilled as Jesse's at turning breech calves and saving valuable livestock, earning his quiet nod of approval that warmed her more than any effusive praise could have. Through it all, something shifted between them. Mutual respect deepening into genuine affection expressed not in grand gestures but in small kindnesses. Jesse carving a set of sturdy combs for Annie's hair after noticing her struggling with her old broken one, Annie sewing extra padding into the shoulder of Jesse's shirt where his war injury caused him pain, both of them finding ways to lighten each other's burdens without being asked. Summer arrived bringing both bounty and challenge as the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. The garden yielding vegetables that Annie preserved for winter, the cattle growing fat on rich grass. Their carefully planned improvements to the barn and chicken coop proving successful, yet also bringing the first signs of a drought that would test them more severely than anything that had come before. Week after week passed without rain, the creek shrinking to a trickle, the grass turning brown and brittle beneath the relentless sun while Jesse and Annie worked from dawn until well after dusk to keep the livestock watered, digging deeper into the creek bed to create pools, hauling water from the well that was itself beginning to show signs of strain. Neighboring ranches began losing cattle to thirst and hunger, but Jesse's knowledge of the land combined with Annie's resourcefulness kept their losses minimal, she creating feed mixtures that stretched their dwindling supplies, he finding sheltered valleys where moisture lingered longer and moving the herd strategically between grazing areas. Through these trials, the walls between them continued to crumble as they collapsed exhausted each night, sometimes talking into the darkness about their hopes and fears, sometimes simply drawing comfort from each other's presence, and sometimes, increasingly, finding solace in each other's arms, their physical connection evolving naturally from the foundation of trust they'd built together. When word came that the general store in Clearwater was selling desperately needed supplies at inflated prices, Jesse and Annie rode into town together, presenting a united front that earned them fair treatment, while other ranchers were being gouged, the storekeeper later telling a neighbor, "That Heartland pair, they're formidable together, like two halves of the same tough coin," a sentiment echoed by others who'd initially regarded their unusual match with skepticism, but now saw the strength of their bond. Midway through the drought, as they were returning from checking the furthest pasture, rain finally came. Not the gentle soaking the land needed, but a violent thunderstorm that split the sky with lightning and sent flash floods roaring down dry creek beds. Racing for shelter, Jesse's horse was spooked by thunder and threw him hard, leaving Annie to half-carry her semi-conscious husband through the downpour to the safety of an old line shack, where she treated his injuries with the limited supplies at hand and kept watch through the night, her fear for him revealing to her the depth of her feelings. Not the idealized romance of her sister's imagination, but something far more profound. A love built on shared struggle, mutual respect, and the daily choice to face whatever came, together. When Jesse regained full consciousness, he reached for her hand and said simply, "Annie, I didn't know what I needed when I sent for a bride, but I know now it was always you." Words that broke something open inside her and allowed her to finally believe she wasn't second best, but perfectly suited to this life and this man. They weathered the remainder of the drought with the same determined partnership that had become their hallmark, their ranch not merely surviving but serving as an example to neighbors who began to seek their advice, particularly Annie's innovative water conservation techniques and feed mixtures. giving her a confidence she'd never experienced back in Nebraska. At summer's end, when the first real soaking rain finally came, Annie and Jesse stood together on their porch watching the life-giving water transform their parched land. His arm around her waist and her head resting against his shoulder, both understanding without words that they had not just endured but flourished in adversity, their unlikely beginning having forged a bond stronger than any conventional courtship could have produced. "We match, you and I," Annie said softly, watching the rain create rivulets in the thirsty soil, to which Jesse replied, "Yes, we do." Simple words that contained multitudes, acknowledgement of their similar practicality, their complementary strengths, their shared values, and the love that had grown between them not despite hardship but because of it, roots sinking deep into fertile soil that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Jesse remained politely distant with Evelyn, observing the sisters' interactions with watchful eyes, catching the moments when Annie's confidence faltered under her sister's practiced undermining, and stepping in with quiet comments that highlighted his wife's contributions to their success. The ranch wouldn't have survived without Annie's innovation with the feed mixtures, and that section of fencing was Annie's design, stronger than anything I'd built before. The contrast between the sisters grew more apparent with each passing day. Annie's hands calloused but capable, moving with purpose through daily chores while Evelyn complained of dust ruining her complexion. Annie's practical knowledge of when to plant, how to preserve, which animals needed special attention, while Evelyn spoke of fashions in Omaha and the latest social scandals. Annie's deep connection to the land and understanding of its rhythms, while Evelyn expressed increasing boredom with the tedious emptiness of Wyoming. Matters came to a head when a sudden snowstorm blew in from the mountains, catching Evelyn outside where she'd gone to avoid helping with canning, the temperature dropping rapidly as Jesse rode out to find her and bring her back to safety, Annie preparing warm blankets and hot tea for their return. Once recovered from her fright and warming by the fire, Evelyn's composure slipped, revealing glimpses of restlessness and dissatisfaction with her own choices that surprised Annie. Comments about Samuel Morrison's parsimony, his controlling nature, the tedium of small-town social obligations. Before her mask slipped firmly back into place and she turned the conversation to her plans for the coming Christmas season, describing elaborate parties and expensive gifts with pointed emphasis on the comforts Annie had sacrificed. That night, after Evelyn had retired to the guest room, Annie found Jesse on the porch despite the cold, staring at the snow-covered mountains. And when she joined him, he said simply, "I see now why you doubted your worth for so long," living in her shadow, his perception warming her more than any fire could. The following morning brought clear skies and Evelyn in a contemplative mood, watching Annie prepare breakfast with efficiency born of daily practice before asking unexpectedly, "Are you truly happy here, Annie? With all this work and isolation?" A question that might have seemed concerned if not for the calculating look in her blue eyes. Annie considered her answer carefully, finally responding, "I've found purpose here, Evelyn. And partnership. Different kinds of happiness than I expected, but deeper," which prompted a look of genuine puzzlement from her sister who clearly couldn't comprehend finding fulfillment in such a life. As the days passed, Evelyn's inquiries became more pointed, her attention to Jesse more deliberate, touching his arm when speaking to him, laughing too brightly at his modest jokes, positioning herself to catch the light most favorably when he was in the room. While her comments to Annie grew increasingly barbed, subtle references to their childhood when Evelyn had always been the favored daughter, reminders of how Annie had always been the practical, plain sister rather than the beautiful one. Jesse's continued indifference to Evelyn's charms clearly frustrated her. His quiet devotion to Annie expressed in small gestures, the way he automatically reached to help with her tasks, how his eyes sought hers across the room, the private language of shared glances they had developed. Until finally, over dinner 1 week into her visit, Evelyn played her hand directly, sighing dramatically and saying, "I can't help but think how different things might have been if circumstances had been different." Her meaning clear as she continued, "If you hadn't sent me in your place, like I was something to be discarded." Annie found her voice then, anger overcoming her usual restraint as she responded, "If you hadn't broken your word and made Father send me instead." To which Evelyn replied with practiced innocence, Annie, dear, I was thinking of your welfare. You seem so resigned to spinsterhood, and I thought this might be your chance. Before turning to Jessie with an expression melting into something soft and appealing. Though I must confess, reading those letters, feeling that connection we shared through words, I've wondered if perhaps we were hasty, if perhaps fate meant for us to find another way to each other. The silence that followed was deafening. Annie feeling something cold settle in her chest as her worst fears crystallized in this moment. Here was Evelyn, beautiful even in the midst of drought and early winter, offering Jessie everything Annie couldn't: beauty, grace, the woman he had originally chosen. The moment stretched until Jessie pushed away from the table and moved to stand behind Annie's chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder, warm and steady, before addressing Evelyn directly. "Mrs. Morrison, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Evelyn batted her eyelashes and asked what kind of misunderstanding, to which Jessie replied with steel in his voice. "You seem to think I made a mistake, that I settled for something less than what I wanted. You're wrong." Evelyn's smile faltered as Jessie continued. The letters were pretty lies, every word calculated to present a picture that had nothing to do with reality. You wrote about parties and social calls, fashion and gossip, not once mentioning if you could birth a calf, mend a fence, stretch a meal to feed unexpected guests, or stand beside a man when the world was burning down around him. When Evelyn protested that those weren't exactly romantic topics, Jessie agreed. "No, they're not. They're real life, my life, the life Annie has embraced without complaint or reservation," before moving around to face Evelyn directly. "You want to know what I see when I look at my wife? I see a woman who told me the truth from the first moment, even when it might have cost her everything. I see someone who works from dawn to dusk, who faces drought and hardship without flinching. I see beauty that goes deeper than skin, strength that comes from character, not from charm." When Evelyn attempted to interrupt, Jessie continued more quietly. "You ask if I wonder how things might have been different. I'll tell you. If you'd kept your word, if you'd come instead of Annie, this ranch would be failing. You'd have run home at the first sign of hardship, the first time you broke a nail or got dust in your hair. And I'd have let you go, grateful to be free of a woman who could only love the idea of something, never the reality. What I have instead is a partner, a wife who sees me as I am, scarred by war, hardened by loss, not always easy to live with, and chooses to stay anyway. So no, Mrs. Morrison, I don't wonder. I don't regret. I thank God every day that you broke your word because it brought me Annie." Annie felt tears blur her vision but blinked them back. This wasn't the time for weakness. Not with Evelyn watching like a hawk for any advantage. Evelyn's beautiful face had gone hard. All pretense of sweetness dropped as she stood, smoothing her skirts with sharp, angry movements, saying, "I see. Well, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Water does find its own level after all." Glancing dismissively at Jessie, "Scarred soldier," before turning back to Annie with narrowed eyes. "When you're old before your time, worn out from work and worry, remember you could have gone home. I would have taken your place." Annie replied simply, "I am home, and my place is here," to which Evelyn snapped, "Then you're a fool," before sweeping toward the door, pausing only to announce that she and Samuel would be married the following month in a spring wedding with all the finest families attending, though she doubted Annie would be able to attend as the journey would be so expensive. After Evelyn's departure, leaving only the lingering scent of French perfume and the echo of wagon wheels retreating into the distance, Annie and Jessie stood in the kitchen, the silence stretching between them until Annie spoke. She was right about one thing. Water does find its own level. Jessie moved to her, pulling her into his arms and asking what she meant, to which Annie replied, "I mean we match. You and I. Not in the way she meant it as an insult, but truly match. We're both scarred, both practical, both more interested in truth than pretty pictures," before looking up at him and adding, "I never thanked you properly for what you said." Jessie murmured that he hadn't said it for thanks but because it was true. Every word. As Annie reached up to touch his face, this good man who saw her truly and loved her anyway, telling him, watching her sit there in her silk dress, trying to make us feel small, I realized I wouldn't trade places with her for anything. Not for all the silk dresses and spring weddings in the world. Because I have something she'll never have. A real partnership built on truth and tested by fire. I have you. Jesse's arms tightened around her as he whispered, "Forever, Annie. That's what I promised at our wedding. And that's what I meant. Forever." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge above the snow-covered landscape, Jesse took Annie's hand and said quietly, "No more ghosts. No more wondering if you were second choice. You were my true choice, Annie, my only choice, the one I'll keep choosing every day for the rest of our lives." To which Annie squeezed his hand, feeling the calluses that matched her own, the strength that had built this life they shared, responding simply, "Forever," and meaning it with every fiber of her being. The land stretched out before them, harsh and beautiful in theirs. Tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, more chances to prove that love wasn't found in pretty letters or silk dresses, but in the choice to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. They had chosen each other not in spite of who they were, but because of it, and that choice, renewed daily in 1,000 small acts of love and partnership, was worth more than all the beauty and wealth in the world. Under the vast Wyoming sky, two hearts beat as one, finally and fully home.